Thanks for staying with us here on The Real Story. The Trump administration is making moves to dismantle the US Department of Education. This week, DOE officials announced sweeping layoffs, some 1,300 workers expected to be out of a job. The president has been promising to shutter the department entirely since before he took office.
I'd like it to be closed immediately. Look, the Department of Education's a big con job.
Joining me now to talk all about this, Kate Diaz, president of the Connecticut Education Association. Kate, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation.
And we have quite a bit to talk about. There's been a lot going on. And I want to start with that latest, as I mentioned, the announcement of the layoffs. We know the president himself can't eliminate the department, but can shrink it. So this past week, as I said, we saw the plans to lay off more than 1,300 employees, about half of the entire department's staff. What was your reaction to that news?
Well, I mean, I'd love to say I was surprised, but I was not. I'm certainly disappointed. When we talk about the functionality of the Department of Education, it's important to keep in mind that really there's three things the department does for us on a basic level. One is the distribution of federal funds to our K-12 and higher education programs. There's also the oversight to ensure that there's adequate and appropriate implementation of the program. So that's some of the work that the Office of Civil Rights does. And then there really is the federal oversight and administration of the student loan programs. So when we talk about reducing the employees in that area, in the Department of Education, that means how efficient are we actually going to be at administering these programs? Are there going to be delays in funding? Are there going to be hang-ups in the distribution of federal funds for a college? I think to me, today we didn't feel that, right? It's in the immediate, you don't necessarily feel, well, what does losing 1,300 employees look like? Right. But I think the long haul question is, what does this look like as we move forward, as the distribution of funds continue, as the questions come up? It's never a problem until it is.
Right. And in a statement after this announcement, the department said these cuts won't impact the agency's ability to carry out statutory obligations, including, as you mentioned, student loans, Pell Grants, funding for students with special needs. Linda McMahon, former WWE executive here in Connecticut, is the new Secretary of Education under President Trump. She's now overseeing this massive reduction in the department. This is what McMahon said this week, explaining the reasoning for these cuts. We want to play that now.
What we did today was to take the first step of eliminating what I think is bureaucratic bloat. He's taken the bureaucracy out of education so that more money flows to the states. Better education is closest to the kids, with parents, with local superintendents, with local school boards.
So kind of framing it there as putting it back locally to the states. We know the Department of Education is one of the smallest departments on a federal level anyway to begin with. What's sort of your response to that reasoning here for these layoffs?
I think what it reflects is a total lack of understanding of what the department does. She constantly refers to policy and curriculum when, in fact, the Department of Education on the federal level has no responsibility in those areas. She's absolutely right that local control is what dictates our policy and curriculum decision making. But they have no impact on that. In fact, statute prohibits them from dipping their toes into those waters. So it's a complete misrepresentation or perhaps misunderstanding of what the department's function truly is. So that's concerning on its own. I think her lack of comprehension about the IDEA and not really even knowing what that is, what it does, and what her responsibility is, makes me concerned that in the end, she's cutting things she doesn't even understand. So on her end, it looks like bureaucratic bloat because she doesn't know what it is. But in practice, these are essential services for children. These are essential resources for children. And so her lack of understanding will ultimately result in fewer services or diminished services for our children.
When it comes to that state lens, what is coming from the federal government, from the Department of Education to Connecticut? Historically, what's being used in the state here? Where are those dollars going?
So a huge chunk, about 120 million of the 320 we receive, is tied up in individuals with disabilities and making sure that the services we provide, the federal reimbursement. Now, On statute, they're supposed to do approximately a 40% reimbursement. They roughly go about 14%. So that $120 million actually far undervalues what they should be contributing. However, it's substantial in the sense that we have many districts for which that gives us special education teachers, paraprofessionals, support service, maybe social workers or counselors that help our students with disabilities. So those are very practical implementation aspects. You know, we're going to see a reduction in paraprofessionals if we see a reduction in those IDEA dollars. In addition, we get what are called title funds. Title funds support our children who may be living in poverty or who have diminished resources. And so those funds are equalization grants, right? They're the idea that all things are not equal. And Connecticut is a great example of that. We have very, very wealthy school districts that may only receive 1% of their budget from the federal government. And then we have higher needs districts that may receive upwards of 20% of their budget from the federal government. Where we see that swing, those 20%, those could be the reading tutors that support our children who are struggling in their literacy journey. Those could be math tutors for children who are struggling in that capacity to try and catch them up to really deal with some of those learning challenges. It could be students with dyslexia that need additional support services. So we have to remember that these are real people and these are real dollars that are supporting children. Maybe it's before and after school programs to help bridge those gaps for our working families. There's a lot of ways that these dollars get used that are very intentional and are really need driven. And so when we talk about any sort of fall off in the distribution of those funds, we're talking about gaps that have to be filled somewhere, right? And one of the ways I think, you know, in the short term, I'm happy to report that the State Department of Education is saying we haven't had any holdback of resources yet. Now, I think that's from the Department of Education. I believe from the Department of Agriculture, there is an impact already, and that's where school funding for lunches comes from. But in this particular lens, the State Department is saying, you know, we haven't seen sort of that stutter of funds. However, there's huge discussions at the federal level about cutting over $300 billion from the federal contribution to education. Those are real dollars that are really going to harm our children.
You mentioned filling that gap. We know CEA is quite often at the state capitol talking with lawmakers, rallying for more support and more funding. I know some of the biggest issues have been staffing shortages, retention of teachers and paraprofessionals and those, you know, in the career and profession as a whole. We're in another budget session. A lot of the conversation from lawmakers is the uncertainty, how they don't know how much they might have to backfill depending on what happens at the federal level. What are you asking for this session from state lawmakers as they're crafting the next 2-year budget?
I'm asking them to be realistic. Connecticut consistently has a surplus. This year we're approximating $1.7 billion. So I'm asking for our legislators to be cognizant of the reality that we're dealing with. Yes, to certainly always be responsible in their budgeting, but let's acknowledge that the state's contribution has actually declined over the last 5 years. We've seen an overall, when I look at the whole scope, of approximately a 2% decrease in the actual contribution of the state to the local municipalities. So while the dollar numbers are increasing, they're not keeping pace with the needs that we're meeting at the local level. So we need them to keep pace, at least level fund. And in our particular consideration, we've put forward legislation really directed at teacher salaries. Those have not even remotely kept pace and have really shored up in the crisis of why are people staying in this profession? And so we're really asking in the immediacy, let's fund teacher salaries and continue to work towards adequately funding our public schools in totality.
And in our last 2 minutes here, we know everything is changing rapidly, as we said, in this situation. But as of this taping, Attorney General William Tong has joined 20 other states in suing the Trump administration to stop these firings at the Department of Education. He's been part of multiple suits against various Trump directives and actions. Some judges have ruled in favor of the states in multiple cases. We just saw, as of this taping, a judge ruling that federal workers at 6 different departments, education not one of them, had to rehire some of those federal workers they laid off in the past 2 weeks. How do you feel about this fight, and does this give you any hope in the short term?
Well, I'm proud to be a part of a state that's willing to fight back and fight for what we know is right, which is the maintenance of our programming, our services to our students. These are vulnerable people, right? These are kids. They don't have the voice themselves. We have to be their voice. And so to have an attorney general who's willing to stand up and fight for the rights of those kids to get the education they deserve, I'm really proud to be in a state that's willing to do that. And I'm really proud to stand side by side with the attorney general and fight with him and to provide whatever resources we can. I'm confident that the educators of Connecticut will show up for that fight. We know how important this is. We know what the stakes are. And therefore, we've got to be in this. And I'm really happy that our government is willing to fight that with us, because I think that's where we're at. This is the moment. And where the courts are going to be the accountability metric, and we're going to have to push into that space. It's not one that we always love to be in, right? Educators are not really dying to do that in the grand scheme of things. But the stakes are high, and it's too important to sit back. So we are grateful that the Attorney General is doing that, and we'll stand with him.
Yeah, and do you have any message for parents or students right now in this moment?
I would say to pay attention. Don't assume that everybody else is going to fix this. Don't assume that everything's going to be okay. I think it's really important that we all, as citizens, engage, pay attention, and make sure that our government's working the way we expect it to work.
Well, Kate, thank you so much for taking a couple minutes. We really appreciate you checking in.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course, that does it for us here now on The Real Story. But if you want to watch these segments again, you can head to fox61.com or download the Fox 61 app and watch The Real Story every Sunday at 10 a.m. right here on Fox 61 Plus. Have a great rest of your morning.